I remember that evening so vividly. It's like a scar in my mind, a moment that marked the beginning of everything unraveling. My husband, Luke, and I were sitting in the living room, surrounded by the quiet hum of our home. The TV played softly in the background, but we weren't really watching it. Luke was there, close enough that I could feel his presence, but at the same time, he felt distant, miles away, lost in his thoughts. I glanced at him, noticing how his gaze kept drifting, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. I tried to brush it off, chalking it up to work stress, or maybe just a long day. But deep down there was this strange feeling, a quiet, nagging tension that I couldn't shake. Trying to close the gap between us, I reached out, resting my hand gently on his arm. He looked down at my hand, almost startled, like he'd forgotten I was there beside him. His response was a quick smile, the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. And then he pulled his arm away, just slightly, enough to leave a chill in the space between us. Something was wrong. I knew it. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, feeling the ground shift beneath your feet, but not knowing when it would finally crumble. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, Luke's phone buzzed. I didn't mean to look, but the screen lit up, catching my eye. A name appeared on the screen, a name I hadn't heard in years but still knew all too well. His ex-girlfriend, Hannah. For a moment, I froze. Questions began swirling in my mind. Why was she texting him? Why was he hiding it from me? And why did he look guilty, as if he knew I'd seen her name? I tried to ignore it, swallowing down the sharp pang of unease, telling myself that it was probably nothing. But as we lay in bed that night, side by side, I couldn't shake the feeling. It was as if a storm was gathering, dark clouds on the horizon, waiting to break. I whispered, "Luke, is everything okay?" Hoping that he'd reassure me, that he'd tell me it was just work stress, something simple. He turned to me, his eyes meeting mine for just a second, and then he looked away. "Yeah, everything's fine," he murmured, his voice too soft, too guarded. But everything was not fine. The days after that text message were like living in a slow-motion dream, a twisted, surreal version of my life that felt close to familiar, but off, somehow. Luke and I moved around each other, shared meals, exchanged small talk, and yet there was something I couldn't shake, a shadow between us stretching longer with each passing day. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. After all, Luke and I had been married for years. I thought I knew him better than anyone else. But sometimes, knowing someone is the problem. I could sense the shift in his demeanor, the careful way he handled his phone, the way he now avoided eye contact just enough to leave a hollow ache in my chest. It started small, little changes in his routine. Where he once would have spent his evenings laughing with me over dinner, now he was frequently too tired or swamped with work. I tried to accept it. After all, people go through phases. But one night, as we sat across from each other, the silence between us became unbearable. He was barely touching his food, scrolling through his phone with that familiar tilt, angling the screen away from my line of sight. I could feel the pulse of irritation building inside me, pressing against the wall I'd built to keep myself calm. I pushed my plate away and took a slow, deep breath, forcing myself to speak in a voice that felt far too steady. "Luke," I said, my voice breaking the stillness. "Who was that text from the other night?" He looked up, caught off guard, his face flashing with something I couldn't quite read. But just as quickly as it appeared, he masked it, giving me a half-hearted smile, the same smile that had begun to feel as hollow as the space between us. "Oh, that?" he said almost casually. "It was just work stuff, last-minute projects and all that." I nodded, not wanting to seem suspicious, but inside, I felt like I was clutching at straws, trying to grasp onto any sliver of reassurance he might offer. Yet none of it felt solid. None of it felt real. And then one night, it happened again. We were lying in bed, the only sounds coming from the hum of the ceiling fan above and the faint city noise filtering through the window. I'd nearly drifted off when I heard his phone buzz again, softly, muffled beneath the covers. I could feel his body tense next to mine. Without a word, he turned over, his back to me, reaching for his phone with the same careful, measured motion he'd used that first night. My heart pounded in the dark, my breath shallow as I tried not to seem awake. But every nerve in my body was alert, listening, waiting. He stayed like that for a while, reading whatever message had come through, his fingers typing something in reply. I felt a strange sense of déjà vu, like this was part of a script, something that had happened before and would happen again if I didn't do something. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to ask the question that had been gnawing at me since that night in the living room. "Luke," I whispered, my voice quiet but firm, "is there something going on with us? You've been so distant lately, and I can't help but feel like something's changed." For a moment, he froze. The silence was thick, so heavy it felt like the walls themselves were leaning in, listening to the space between us. He took a deep breath, then finally turned back to face me, his expression softening, though I could see a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "Sarah, you're overthinking things," he said, reaching out to brush a hand along my arm. "I've just been busy, stressed with work. Nothing more. I promise." I wanted to believe him. More than anything, I wanted to accept his words and let them sink in, to let them be the balm to this wound of doubt. But something about his touch felt distant, as though there was a glass wall between us that neither of us could reach across. Still, I nodded, whispering, "Okay," because what else could I say? He'd given me the answer I'd asked for, even if it didn't feel quite like the truth. As he drifted back to sleep, I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, feeling like I was holding my breath. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong, that there was more he wasn't saying. But with no proof, I was left with nothing but my own growing unease, a feeling that I was standing on the edge of a cliff with no idea what lay at the bottom. In the days that followed, I began to notice more signs, each one small enough on its own, but together forming a picture I didn't want to see. He started leaving early for work, earlier than usual, with vague excuses and hurried goodbyes. When I'd ask if he wanted to spend the weekend together, he'd nod, saying, "Of course," but then cancel last minute, claiming he'd forgotten about some work obligation. And it wasn't just the absences. It was the look in his eyes when he thought I wasn't paying attention, the way he'd glance at his phone, a slight curve of his lips that felt almost secretive, as if he were living a life I wasn't part of. Then, one Saturday morning, he mentioned needing to run an errand. A quick trip to the hardware store, he'd said. I'd offered to come along, but he'd brushed me off, saying it would only take a few minutes. Minutes turned to an hour, then another. I tried to distract myself, telling myself not to overreact, that he'd probably just gotten caught up in something. But that itch of suspicion wouldn't go away. And when he finally came back, there was a faint smell lingering around him, a perfume I didn't recognize. It was floral, light, and feminine. My mind raced, but I kept my face calm, watching him closely. I waited until he left the room before I reached out for his coat, lifting it to my nose, inhaling that strange scent that felt so foreign in our home. I stood there, holding the coat, feeling a hollow ache take root in my chest. It was like I was looking through a keyhole, seeing something I couldn't fully make out, but knowing that it was something I wasn't supposed to see. As he came back into the room, I quickly set the coat on, forcing a smile as he glanced over at me. "You okay?" he asked, his tone light, casual, as if everything was normal. I swallowed, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Yeah, just fine," I replied, my heart pounding as I watched him closely, trying to see through the cracks in his mask. But he just nodded, giving me a small, distant smile before walking away. And in that moment, I felt something inside me shift, a quiet determination to find out what he wasn't telling me, to uncover the truth that I could sense, lurking just out of reach. Because whatever it was, I knew one thing for certain. The life I thought I knew was slipping away, piece by piece, and if I didn't find the answers soon, I'd be left standing in the dark. Days passed, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I'd wake up, feeling it there, this dull ache that never fully left. Each morning felt heavier than the last, the tension building between us like a cord pulled too tight, just waiting to snap. I tried to go about my daily routines, hoping that, somehow, things would settle back into place. But Luke's behavior only grew more distant, more secretive. And with every glance, every half-smile that he gave me, I felt a widening chasm opening between us. It was during one of these long, quiet days when I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. I was standing by the kitchen sink, staring out the window, lost in thought. A memory floated back to me, a time when Luke and I used to spend weekends just talking, laughing, and sharing every small part of our lives. We were inseparable then, or so I'd thought. But those days felt like they belonged to another lifetime now, like a dream I was only half awake from. As I stood there, I felt a flicker of resolve, something sharp and fierce pushing up against the fear and uncertainty that had paralyzed me for so long. I needed answers. I couldn't keep living in this half-reality, with shadows and secrets lurking around every corner. So that afternoon, while Luke was out, I found myself reaching for his laptop. It was sitting there, closed, unassuming, as if it held none of the weight of the questions that had been haunting me. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the lid, my breath catching in my throat. Part of me felt guilty, like I was crossing a line that I couldn't uncross. But a stronger part of me, the part that needed to know, pushed past the guilt. The screen flickered to life, and I found myself staring at his emails, his messages, every small piece of his life neatly organized in front of me. I clicked through, scanning, looking for anything that might give me some clarity. Then I found it, an email from Hannah. My heart clenched as I saw her name, that all-too-familiar name, staring back at me from the screen. It was from a few weeks ago, around the time when I'd first started noticing the change in him. With a deep breath, I opened the email, my eyes skimming over the words. It wasn't long, just a brief message, but every sentence felt like a small cut, slicing into the foundation of everything I thought I knew. "Luke, I can't stop thinking about you," she'd written, her words casual yet intimate, like they shared a secret language that I could never understand. Being back in touch has brought up so much, and I can't help wondering what might have been. My hands tightened around the edges of the laptop, my knuckles turning white as I read the words again, each one a dagger twisting deeper into my chest. There was more. A string of messages, each one peeling back a layer of the truth I'd been so desperate to avoid. She talked about memories, about old times, about things they'd done together that he'd never mentioned to me. There were hints, allusions to meetings, to long conversations that he'd never shared. I could feel my stomach twisting as I scrolled down, my pulse pounding in my ears. Just as I thought I couldn't bear to read another word, I found one message that stopped me cold. "I'm not saying things should be any different," she'd written, "but you know that part of me will always wonder if we made the right choices. And I can't help thinking, maybe it isn't too late." Too late. The words hung in the air, a ghost of a promise, or perhaps a threat, whispering that everything I'd feared was true. She wasn't just an old flame, an ex lingering on the edges of his past. She was someone he still thought about, someone he still held space for in his life. I closed the laptop, my hands trembling as I sat there in the silence, the weight of everything I'd just read pressing down on me like a stone. I felt a wave of nausea, the bile rising in my throat, but I forced it down, gripping the edge of the table to steady myself. This wasn't just in my head. The suspicions, the doubts, they were real. He had kept this part of his life hidden from me, guarded behind half-truths and evasions, and I'd been left on the outside, clinging to the scraps he threw my way. I stood there for what felt like hours, the world around me fading into the background. My mind raced, piecing together every strange look, every hushed conversation, every moment when he'd pulled away. All of it led back to her, to Hannah. A part of me wanted to confront him, to demand the truth right there, to force him to look me in the eyes and explain how he could keep something like this from me. But another part of me, the part that was still reeling from the shock, held back. I knew I couldn't rush this. I needed to be sure, to see the full picture before I took that final step. I stood there for what felt like hours, the world around me fading into the background. My mind raced, piecing together every strange look, every hushed conversation, every moment when he'd pulled away. All of it led back to her, to Hannah. A part of me wanted to confront him, to demand the truth right there, to force him to look me in the eyes and explain how he could keep something like this from me. But another part of me, the part that was still reeling from the shock, held back. I knew I couldn't rush this. I needed to be sure, to see the full picture before I took that final step. So I closed the laptop, taking a deep, steadying breath. I knew that, whatever happened next, I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. I couldn't pretend that everything was fine, that we could go back to the way things were. As I stood there, I felt a quiet resolve settling over me, a determination that cut through the fear and uncertainty. I didn't know where this would lead or what I'd uncover, but one thing was certain. I wouldn't live in the dark anymore. And with that thought, I turned away, my heart pounding, ready to take the next step toward the truth, no matter where it would lead. That evening, I sat in silence, waiting for Luke to come home. My mind was spinning, my heart pounding, as I replayed every word in those emails, every memory they'd shared that I had never been part of. Each minute felt like an hour, stretching painfully as I waited, my thoughts bouncing between anger, betrayal, and disbelief. When I finally heard his footsteps outside the door, I straightened, forcing myself to stay calm. I didn't want him to see how rattled I was. I needed to approach this carefully, to keep my emotions in check, no matter how much my heart was breaking inside. Luke walked in, looking a little tired, but otherwise the same as always. He gave me a small smile, setting his keys down on the counter, glancing at me as if nothing were amiss. I almost laughed at the ease in his expression, the casual way he moved around our home as though he hadn't been hiding pieces of his life from me. I waited until he sat down across from me before I spoke, choosing my words carefully. "Luke," I began, my voice soft but steady, "we need to talk." He looked up, surprise flashing across his face. He opened his mouth to say something, but I cut him off, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "It's about her," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "About Hannah." At the mention of her name, he stilled, his gaze sharpening, the muscles in his jaw tightening ever so slightly. For a moment, he just stared at me, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his eyes. And in that brief, silent moment, I felt the weight of everything that had gone unspoken between us, pressing down like a shadow. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I don't know what you're talking about." But his words felt weak, flimsy, like a wall made of paper. I could see the guilt in his eyes, the hesitation, the way he couldn't quite meet my gaze. It was all there, every unspoken truth, hanging between us, taunting me with its silence. "Luke, I saw the emails," I said, my voice low but unrelenting. "I know you've been talking to her, that you've been keeping things from me." He closed his eyes, letting out a long, slow breath, his shoulders slumping as he sat back. It was as if the fight had drained out of him, leaving only a tired, worn-out shell of the man I'd married. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the air thick with tension, heavy with everything that had been hidden for far too long. Finally, he opened his eyes, meeting my gaze with a resigned look. "It's not what you think," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "It's just, we've known each other for a long time, Sarah. There's history there. Things that we never really let go of." His words cut through me like ice, each one a reminder of everything he'd kept hidden, everything he'd chosen to share with her instead of me. I could feel the anger building, pressing against the dam I'd built to hold it back, threatening to spill over. "So that's it?" I asked, my voice trembling with barely contained fury. "You thought it was okay to keep secrets, to hide this part of your life from me? After all these years, after everything we've been through?" He looked down, his hands twisting in his lap, the guilt clear on his face. But he didn't speak, didn't offer any excuses, any apologies. And that silence, the absence of any real remorse, was somehow worse than anything he could have said. I stood up, turning away from him, my mind racing as I struggled to process everything. I'd come into this conversation wanting answers, hoping that maybe somehow he'd have a reason, an explanation that would make it all make sense. But instead, all I felt was a hollow, aching emptiness, a sense of betrayal that went deeper than words. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to keep calm, to keep control. "Is there anything else I should know?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Luke hesitated, his gaze shifting as he fidgeted in his seat, a flicker of something almost regretful passing across his face. But when he spoke, his words were careful, measured, as if he were holding back, keeping something hidden. "No," he said, shaking his head. That's all there is." But I didn't believe him. Not anymore. As I stood there, looking at the man I'd thought I knew, I realized that the Luke sitting in front of me wasn't the man I'd married, wasn't the partner I'd trusted with my life, my heart. He was someone else entirely. Someone who'd made choices without me, who'd kept secrets I would never fully understand. And in that moment, I knew that this was only the beginning. There was more to the story, more to the truth that lay buried beneath his words, waiting to be uncovered. And no matter how much it hurt, no matter how deep the betrayal ran, I was going to find it. Because I couldn't live like this, trapped in a web of lies and half-truths, with a man who'd chosen someone else, even if he couldn't admit it. I turned away, my heart pounding, my mind racing with questions that had no answers. But one thing was clear. I wasn't going to rest until I found the truth. The days following that conversation with Luke felt like a waking nightmare. I went through the motions, pretending that everything was fine, but inside, I was a whirlwind of emotions. Hurt, anger, disbelief, and, more than anything, a relentless determination to uncover the truth he was so desperately trying to hide. I'd never imagined I'd find myself in this place, feeling like a stranger in my own marriage, second-guessing every word, every look. But I couldn't let it go. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, the guilt etched into every line, the way he'd fumbled through excuses, each one weaker than the last. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't keep pretending, couldn't keep living in the shadows of his secrets. And so, one evening, as Luke left for another of his work meetings, I decided it was time to stop being passive. I was going to find the answers myself. After he left, I went to his office. I'd never been the type to snoop, but in that moment, I didn't care. I rifled through his desk drawers, feeling a strange mixture of dread and anticipation with every paper, every file I touched. Most of it was harmless, work documents, bills, mundane details of our shared life. But then I found his journal. It was hidden in the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a pile of papers as if he hadn't wanted it to be found. My heart pounded as I picked it up, my fingers trembling as I flipped through the pages. I told myself I shouldn't do this, that whatever I found would only deepen the rift between us. But a stronger part of me, the part that was desperate for the truth, couldn't stop. At first, it was just ordinary notes, to-do lists, thoughts about work. But as I skimmed further, I found entries that were anything but ordinary. Pages filled with reflections, memories he'd never shared with me, confessions of feelings he'd never voiced. And then her name appeared. Hannah. My breath caught as I read, my eyes darting over the lines, each word cutting into me like a blade. He wrote about her often, with a tenderness that felt like a betrayal. Words that hinted at emotions he hadn't let go of. He talked about seeing her again, about how it brought back memories, how it made him question choices he'd thought were long behind him. But the worst part, the part that shattered whatever hope I'd been clinging to, was a single line, scrawled in the margin, almost as if he'd tried to hide it even from himself. I can't help wondering, what if I'd chosen her? I felt the ground shift beneath me, as though the life I'd known had been built on sand, slowly crumbling beneath the weight of his words. He'd written this, here, in our home, in the life we'd built together. He'd questioned it all, leaving me out of his thoughts, out of the future he was imagining, even if it was just in secret. For a long moment I sat there, clutching the journal, my mind spinning as the full weight of his betrayal sank in. I could feel the tears pricking at my eyes, the familiar ache building in my chest, but I forced myself to hold it together. I couldn't fall apart, not yet, not until I'd seen the full picture. Taking a deep breath, I set the journal aside, my gaze shifting back to the desk. I opened his laptop again, this time with purpose, with a sense of urgency that left no room for hesitation. The emails were still there, as damning as they'd been the first time. But as I scrolled through, I found a new message, one that hadn't been there before. It was from Hannah, sent just hours earlier, and as I read it, my stomach twisted, the bile rising in my throat. "Luke, I can't keep pretending," she'd written. "We need to talk about what this really means. You know how I feel. I need to know if you're willing to go through with it." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, the words blurring as the reality of what she was suggesting settled over me. She wasn't just an ex, a shadow from his past. She was someone he was actively choosing, someone he was willing to keep in his life, even if it meant betraying everything we'd built together. I sat there, staring at the screen, my mind numb as I tried to process the implications of her message. What did she mean? Go through with it? Was he planning something? Leaving me? Ending our marriage? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing. I couldn't sit back and wait for him to decide the fate of our lives. I couldn't let him continue living this double life, pretending that everything was fine, while he held this part of himself back from me. So I closed the laptop, my hands steady as I shut it down, putting everything back as I'd found it. I wasn't ready to confront him, not yet. I needed time to process, to gather my thoughts, to prepare myself for the conversation that would change everything. As I stood there in the dim light of his office, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. It wasn't peace, exactly, but a quiet resolve, a knowledge that whatever happened next, I would face it head-on. I wouldn't hide in the shadows anymore. I wouldn't be the passive, trusting wife he thought he could deceive. Because no matter how much it hurt, I knew I deserved better than this half-life, this existence filled with lies and empty promises. And as I left his office, closing the door softly behind me, I felt a glimmer of strength, one that I hadn't known I possessed. I wasn't going to be his afterthought. I was going to be the one in control, the one who decided what happened next. And whatever he chose, whatever truth he thought he could keep hidden, I would face it, with or without him. The house was eerily silent when Luke finally came home that evening. I'd spent hours rehearsing what I would say, how I'd confront him, what words I'd use to make him face the reality of what he'd done. But now that he was here, standing just a few feet away, every emotion I'd held back seemed to surge forward all at once. He looked at me, a hint of confusion in his gaze as he set his bag down. "Sarah, are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with casual concern. It was the tone, the ease of his question, that snapped something inside me. I could feel my hands trembling as I stood up, taking a step toward him, my eyes fixed on his face. "No, Luke, I'm not okay," I said, my voice steady but cold. "I'm far from okay." He paused, a shadow passing over his face as he took in the tension in the room, the barely concealed anger in my eyes. For a moment he just looked at me, his expression guarded, as if he was trying to figure out exactly how much I knew. "Sarah," he started, his voice gentle, as if he could somehow diffuse the situation with a soft tone. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, feeling the words gather in my chest, sharp and unrelenting. "What's going on?" I echoed, my voice trembling. "I think you know exactly what's going on, Luke. I know about the emails. I know about Hannah." He flinched, the color draining from his face as he realized there was no way out, no way to pretend anymore. For a brief second, he looked vulnerable, as though the weight of his choices had finally caught up with him. But just as quickly, he composed himself, his expression hardening. "It's not what you think," he said, his tone defensive, his gaze shifting away from mine. "Hannah and we just reconnected, that's all. There's nothing serious." "Nothing serious?" I repeated, my voice rising, unable to contain the anger that had been building for weeks. "Is that what you call sneaking around behind my back, hiding your conversations, writing about how you wonder if you made the right choice? If I was the right choice?" He looked down, his hands twisting together, the silence stretching between us, heavy and suffocating. I could feel my chest tightening, the pain of his betrayal settling deep inside. Yet still, I waited, giving him one last chance to explain. "Sarah," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to get this far. It just happened. Seeing her again brought back memories, feelings I thought I'd let go of a long time ago." The words felt like a slap, each one cutting deeper than the last. I shook my head, unable to believe what I was hearing. He hadn't let go. He'd been holding on to this part of his past, this part of himself, without ever telling me, without ever letting me in. "And what about me, Luke?" I asked, my voice breaking. "What about everything we've been through together? Our life, our marriage, was that just something you could brush aside because you saw her again?" He looked up, his expression pained. But there was something else there too, something that looked almost like regret. "It's not like that," he said, his voice strained. "I love you, Sarah. I do. But with Hannah, it's complicated. We never had closure. We ended things without really knowing if it was what either of us wanted. And when I saw her again, it brought everything back." I could feel the tears welling up, the weight of his words crashing over me, suffocating in their honesty. I'd asked for the truth, and here it was, raw and painful, cutting through any illusion I'd clung to. "So what now?" I asked, forcing myself to look at him, to meet his gaze. Do you plan to leave? To go back to her? Is that what you want? For a moment, he didn't respond. He just stood there, his face etched with conflict, as though he was wrestling with a decision he hadn't fully made. And in that silence, I felt a part of myself shatter, the pieces falling away, leaving only the harsh, undeniable reality of our situation. I don't know, he said finally, his voice filled with a quiet desperation that felt almost cruel. I don't know what I want. His words hung in the air, a testament to the choice he wasn't willing to make, the truth he couldn't bring himself to face. And as I looked at him, standing there, torn between me and the past he hadn't let go of, I felt something shift inside me. I took a shaky breath, the anger, the hurt, the betrayal all swirling together into something resolute, something that felt like strength. Well, I know what I want, I said, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my face. I want someone who's sure, someone who doesn't keep me waiting while he decides if I'm good enough. I deserve better than this, Luke. Better than someone who can't let go of the past. He looked up, his face stricken, as though my words had finally hit him, piercing through whatever walls he'd built around himself. For a moment I saw a flicker of remorse, of understanding. But it was too late. Without another word, I turned, my feet carrying me out of the room, away from the man who had once been my whole world. I could hear him calling after me, his voice filled with something close to panic. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back, because as I walked away, I realized that I was done waiting. Done holding on to someone who couldn't hold on to me. And as the door closed behind me, I felt a strange, quiet sense of freedom, like I'd finally broken free from the chains of a love that had never truly been mine. The first night alone was harder than I could have imagined. I lay in bed, the silence around me thick, pressing in from all sides. Every corner of our home felt haunted by memories, by moments I'd once thought were permanent, secure. Now those memories felt hollow, remnants of a life that had slipped through my fingers. But as the hours dragged on, the ache in my chest slowly dulled, settling into a quieter, more manageable pain. I found myself staring at the ceiling, breathing through the hurt, a strange determination growing inside me, a quiet resolve that hadn't been there before. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. Some moments I was overcome with sadness, grieving the future I thought I'd have with Luke. Other times I felt angry, a righteous fury that made me want to scream, to let out every ounce of pain he'd left me with. But beneath it all, there was something else, something steadier, like a small flickering flame in the darkness. I knew I couldn't live in the past. Not anymore. Luke had made his choice, and in doing so, he'd freed me from the weight of trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. And as painful as it was, I was beginning to realize that this might be my chance. My chance to build something new, something that belonged to me alone. Each morning, I got up a little stronger. I'd stand by the window, watching the world go by, finding comfort in the routine of daily life. I'd go for walks, breathing in the fresh air, feeling my mind clear with every step, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to feel the weight lifting, piece by piece. One afternoon, as I was sorting through a pile of old papers, I found a photo of Luke and me from the early days of our marriage. We looked so young, so happy, as if the world had been made just for us. But as I looked closer, I realized that the woman in that photo wasn't me anymore. She was someone who'd loved with her whole heart, someone who'd believed in promises and forever. And while that part of me still existed, I knew that I'd grown, that I'd changed. Gently, I set the photo aside, feeling a sense of closure settle over me. This wasn't a life I could go back to, nor one I wanted to. I was moving forward, step by step, learning to build a life that was mine, a life that didn't depend on anyone else's choices or promises. As the weeks passed, I began to rediscover parts of myself I'd forgotten, the passions, the dreams I'd set aside in the comfort of our marriage. I started filling my time with things that brought me joy. Long walks, afternoons spent reading, reconnecting with old friends who welcomed me with open arms. Each day, I found something to be grateful for, something that reminded me of the strength I'd found within myself. And gradually, that strength grew, blossoming into something I hadn't expected. A quiet contentment, a peace that came from knowing I'd chosen myself, that I'd refused to settle for less than I deserved. One evening, as the sun set, casting a warm, golden light across my apartment, I felt a sense of pride wash over me. I'd faced the truth, no matter how painful, and in doing so I'd reclaimed my life, my happiness. It hadn't been easy, and there were still hard days, moments when the memories crept in, lingering like shadows. But each time I reminded myself of how far I'd come, of the woman I was becoming, a woman who could stand alone, who could find strength in her own resilience. Because in the end, I hadn't just lost Luke. I'd found myself. As time went on, I began to see my life with fresh eyes. The pain was still there, woven into the fabric of my days, but it had softened, becoming something I could carry rather than something that carried me. I'd survived the heartbreak, the betrayal, and in doing so, I'd discovered parts of myself I hadn't known were there. Strengths I didn't know I possessed. It's strange how life's hardest moments can also be its most transformative. What had once felt like the end of my world had become the beginning of something entirely new. A chance to rebuild from the ground up. And this time, I was building something stronger. Something that couldn't be shaken by the choices of others. I'd started picking up new hobbies, filling my time with activities that brought me joy and peace. I signed up for a painting class, something I'd always wanted to try but never made time for. I poured myself into books, into art, into the simple pleasures of daily life that I'd once taken for granted. One evening, I was sitting on the balcony, watching the sunset as it painted the sky with hues of pink and orange. There was a peace in the air, a stillness that felt like a quiet blessing, as if the universe were giving me permission to let go, to release the last remnants of pain that I'd held on to. I thought back to all the moments I'd spent with Luke, the love we'd shared, the life we'd built. It hadn't been all bad. There had been real joy, real connection. And while it hadn't lasted, I knew now that it was okay to cherish those memories, to hold on to the good while letting go of the rest. With a deep breath, I closed my eyes, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over me. Gratitude not just for the good times, but for the lessons, for the strength I'd found in the midst of heartbreak. I'd learned that I was enough, that I didn't need anyone else's approval, anyone else's promises, to feel whole. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a smile tug at my lips, a warmth spreading through me that had nothing to do with the fading light. I was ready to face the future, to embrace whatever lay ahead with an open heart and an unbreakable spirit. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. I wasn't waiting for someone else to complete me, to fill the empty spaces. I was whole, standing tall on my own, and that knowledge filled me with a quiet, powerful joy. To anyone else who's felt the sting of betrayal, who's had to pick up the pieces of a broken heart, I want to say this. There is life beyond the pain, strength beyond the hurt. And while the journey may be difficult, the destination is worth every step. As I stood there, gazing out over the city, I felt a sense of freedom, of hope, knowing that this was just the beginning of a life that was entirely my own. Because in the end, the greatest love story I'd ever have was the one I'd written with myself. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and self-discovery. Drop a comment if you've ever had to let go of something that wasn't meant for you, and let's support each other on this path toward healing.